Thank you. It's good to be with you. So we're kicking off a new series today. We've entitled it "Love Your Enemies," and I just want to fill you in a little bit. The inspiration behind doing this series is the recognition that our culture is absurdly divided today. Absurdly divided. We have, especially in political realms, devolved into what anthropologists call tribalism. And it's where groups of people collect around an ideology, usually. And they do that because it glues them together. And it gives that tribe a sense of safety in numbers when they do that. Well, this worked really well for us in our evolutionary past because it helped us to survive the wilds that we had little to no control over. So it made sense to gather into tribes, and it even made sense that those tribes would war against each other. But we don't live in that world anymore. We don't live in that world. So the question is, why are we regressing back into tribalism? Why is there such division in our culture? The dangers of that world back then created a kind of anxiety for us that's unique to humankind. And the reason that it's unique is because humanity is unique among all the different life forms that populate this planet. We are the only life form, as far as we can tell, that understands the fact that we're going to die someday. And this creates what psychologists and sociologists call existential anxiety. We know we're going to die, yet we have this drive to survive, just like the rest of the animal kingdom. And it creates a tension. And at least in part, one of the ways that we came up with to cope with that tension is through our spiritual beliefs, our religions. Now, we had this thing called the scientific revolution that came along. And we have benefited greatly. Nobody here could deny that we have benefited tremendously from the scientific revolution. Most of our lives depend on it in every way. A lot of good stuff. We're even on the cusp, believe it or not, you can check this for yourselves, of defeating mortality itself. Some scientists are saying if you can make it 12 years, there will be therapies in place that may have you, and certainly our children, asking a different kind of question than mankind has ever had to ask. Up to this point, we've been asking what happens when we die and trying to figure that out in our existential angst. Now we may be asking the question, what happens if I never die? Now, that's all good. At least some think so. But that's the positive side. There's a negative side to the scientific progress that we've had, and it's the formation of a new kind of anxiety that some call nihilistic anxiety. And it is the fear of not becoming non-existent, but rather having a meaningless existence. Do we matter? Ultimately, is there any meaning to any of this? Because we're all still asking the questions, what's this all about, this mystery? Why do we exist? What's going on? Well, the materialism of the natural sciences kind of killed off our gods, at least those old superstitious gods. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing in and of itself, because the truth is the truth. But what it also did is it left us with this fear and this dread, this vulnerability, this nakedness in this self-made Eden that we have created. And so, as a result, tribes are gathering again, some around the old gods, some around political ideology, some around New Age, some around just rational thinking called scientism. But they're all grasping for the same thing. They're all grasping for meaning. Carl Jung is credited with saying, we can keep from a child all knowledge of earlier myths, but we cannot take from him the need for mythology. Mythology is not about telling fairy tales. Mythology is about articulating truths that we don't know how to articulate without symbols. That's what it really is. And we need that. That's what we have called traditionally religion. We need religion. To me, this is objectively true. Here's why. We need that outlet, that phenomenon by which our subconscious angst and our questions about existence have an outlet that can only find articulation in symbolism. We need it, and we've been left without it. And so, many reacting in fear, they gather into tribes, they fail to see the value of religion, scientism. And then on the other side of the polar spectrum, we have tribes that gather that refuse to think rationally. A lot of that, unfortunately, is found in the Christian church. Neither one can succeed. Both are doomed to fail when it comes to helping our culture to deal with the angst that we have that's feeding into so many issues and the divisiveness that we see. So what are we to do? I mean, is there really any hope that a Republican can take off his glasses and that he filters the world through and it makes it impossible for him to see that the Democratic side might have some good ideas? Is it possible? Can we really expect the Democrat to do the same thing and see that some conservative ideas have merit? Is that possible? Is it possible that the scientist could ever be expected to peer over his spectacles and gaze at the face of God? Is that possible? Is there any hope that a fundamentalist can replace his glasses of dogma and his false sense of security and all of that? I think there is. But the world that I'm hoping for necessitates a courage, and it's the courage to follow Jesus, not just believe in concepts about Jesus. It's the courage to leave tribes of fear and contempt, the courage to allow him to remove those blinders from our eyes and to see his face in the face of others, even in the face of those we consider enemies. It's not easy. It takes both the effort to think rationally and to live in faith according to those principles that frankly often seem like they lack common sense. It takes thinking. That leads to this first point. Following Jesus doesn't take common sense. It takes uncommon sense. Make no mistake, I've been studying religion for my entire adult life. I know a lot about a lot of religions. Jesus is a unique genius. We shouldn't think that we can approach many of his teachings without thinking hard. Carl Jung also said, look, thinking is hard. That's why most people prefer to simply judge. It's true, isn't it? But it's not the way to the abundant life that Jesus promised us. Comprehending and living by that wisdom takes more than common sense. It takes uncommon sense. So one of the most counterintuitive teachings of Jesus is this one. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you. And if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Jesus is a genius. But when you read those words, just admit it. Some of it just seems totally impractical. What do you mean, give them my shirt too? Or in Matthew's version, what do you mean walk with them 2 miles if they tell me I have to walk 1 mile? Well, there's some context there that has to be understood. Jesus understood, for example, that, look, the enemy of Rome is an enemy that cannot be defeated by violent insurrection. You're not going to defeat these guys. And if you keep on that trajectory, what's going to happen is what has happened to our people time and time again in our past. That more powerful enemy, that enemy we cannot defeat violently, will overrun us and destroy us and carry us away, just like we've seen again and again. So, a Roman soldier does have the right by law to ask you to walk a mile carrying his stuff, all of his equipment. Give him 2. That's fine, that fits for that context and that day and age, but does it have any meaning for us? Is it relevant for us? And that's a good question, but of course it does. And it's this. Jesus understood, and he wants us to understand, that an enemy only remains an enemy as long as he actually is your enemy. But he is defeated as an enemy as soon as he is not my enemy. And the greatest way to convert an enemy to a friend is to love them. So I want to share some memes. This is what the world thinks of some of the teachings that we've inherited through the centuries, the twistings of Jesus' teaching. So they look at it like we're ridiculous. So, they quote the verse there, and then Jesus has to say to the crowd, guys, I'm serious. Why are you laughing? Yeah, they're thinking the same thing that, if we're honest, we often think. Does that really make any sense? I love this one, Chris Farley. People say alcoholism's my worst enemy, but Jesus said love your enemies. Ha! So they just kind of make fun of this stuff, This is my favorite. You'll have to think about this one a little bit. So he says, love your enemies, and do good to those who hate you. And then he leans over to his buddy and he whispers in his ear, as for my enemies, I'm going to burn them. You love your enemies, but I'm going to burn mine in hell for eternity. Is it any wonder that the world thinks this way and they kind of poke fun at this stuff? They're not dumb. They can't buy into some of the nonsense that we've come up with over the years. They just can't, and I don't blame them. We were sitting around the dinner table the other night, and my wife and my two boys, and this particular verse came up. And it came up because Ben was taunting Joseph, as is common in my house. And so the little brother, Joseph, he says, Ben, when I get bigger, I'll have my revenge on your face. And he does this, face. And that shocked Mom. Mom's like, oh. Ben, why are you being so mean to him? And Joseph, Ben is your brother, not your enemy. And so he says, and this made me a little proud, I got to admit. He says, yeah, I don't want to return evil for evil. Oh, he remembered that verse. Then my pride was diminished when he followed up with this. But if he was my enemy, then I'd beat him up. Mom says, no, Jesus said to love your enemies. He said that too. And then Ben says, that's stupid. Pride is gone. My pride it's gone. But I get it. It's counterintuitive. Ben doesn't know the political circumstances, the world that Jesus was living in, and why he said those specific things to make his point. But the point for us still lies within the wisdom of his teaching. Jesus wants us to realize that people are people, and that never changes. He wants us to know the more that we see them as being people, people that have many of the same fears, hopes, joys, struggles that we have, the more that we see them as those people, the less they will look like enemies. And that leads to the second point. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It comes from this verse in the Bible, written by Paul to the church in Ephesus. He says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. What Paul is pointing out is that, look, people are people. It's not the people that are our enemies. It is the ideologies that have come through men thinking about how to bring order to the chaos that we're living in, and the oppressive systems that are built up over the centuries that keep the many oppressed for the sake of the few. He understood this, and this is the point he's trying to bring across. People are people. Did you know that 1 in 6 Americans, think about this, 1 in 6 Americans have stopped talking to close friends or family members over the election of 2016? That's beyond ridiculous. Really, it is. Arthur Brooks is a social scientist who recently released a book, conveniently, titled Love Your Enemies. He said this, just like Jesus, just like Paul, when you love your enemies, If you really strive to do that, what you end up finding out is that they really weren't your enemies after all. They're just people. Brooks identified something really important, and there are a lot of social scientists and a lot of think tank leaders like him and psychologists and whatnot trying to figure out why it is that our culture is so divided, because it's really becoming a bigger and bigger problem for us. And so the conclusion that he came to is the main contributor to the deterioration of relationships is not what most people would think it is. It's not anger. It's not really just the differences. What it really amounts to is this thing called contempt. What is contempt? It's defined as the feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration, worthless, deserving scorn, that their lives and their input is meaningless. Tolerance isn't the cure either. I was shocked to hear that, because my usual go-to is, hey, let's just agree to disagree. But he said that's not really the answer either, because we need to dialogue over things. He said loving someone doesn't mean agreeing with them or even agreeing to disagree with them. We have a responsibility to say what we think, because ideas have consequences. So we have to speak up. We have to dialogue with one another and bring the value out of that dialogue. But we cannot go into that dialogue with contempt for the person that we're talking to, because that strips them of their value and any possible meaning they might be contributing right from the get-go, and that means that there is no real dialogue. And so there is no real solution to the problems that we all have. Is this making sense? Psychologist John Gottman, I heard on a podcast recently, Dak Shepard's podcast, he told Dak Shepard that he could predict within 90% accuracy after couples counseling for 1 hour, 90% accuracy, he could tell whether or not that couple was going to make it or if their marriage was going to end in divorce within 3 years. Well, he says the same thing. Contempt is the problem. It's not, the leading indicator of divorce is not finance. It's not, he said. I've done too much research at this point. That's not what it is. It is not differences in how to rear the children. It's none of that. We all have differences. We all can argue and fight with one another, but this is how I know if a marriage is going to make it. I watch for the rolling of eyes. I watch for dismissive gestures. I listen for sarcastic tones. That contempt is the main indicator of a future divorce. So why has it become the main culprit? Well, maybe you're connecting it already. We have this angst. We have this fear of a meaningless existence. And when I have somebody, usually someone close to me, acting as though I don't matter, it prods at that fear, which for most people is subconscious. But this is what the experts are finding out. It's there. It's foundational to us. How did we get there? Have you ever been treated with contempt? Of course you have. Have you ever treated somebody with contempt? I have. When I was a kid, I was in Scouts. There was a kid named Ben in my Scout troop. We bullied Ben, me and my buddies. I wasn't really much of a bully, that's true. I was usually a pretty nice kid. I had other kids that were quirky, that were my friends, and so on. But this kid really rubbed me wrong for some reason, so I chimed in with the bullying, and I even became a ringleader, if you will, in the Scout troop that way. He was getting all these badges. He was very intelligent. I like to feel like I'm the smartest guy in the group, so this really bothered me. And he was quirky, and so I used that as an excuse to bully him. So one night at the Scout meeting, before things had started, we're all just hanging out, talking and playing and whatever. And because I had really worked hard on ways to inflict pain on my friends, you know, a test of manhood kind of thing, I was very good at this. This is called a torque fight. Not a torque fight, but torque fight. I can do that too. No. This is where you wrap each other's knuckles until somebody gives up. You go, wham! The other thing I was really good at was the scorpion sting. Or mine, they nicknamed the snake bite. And that's where you pinch somebody's skin between the knuckle of your thumb and the knuckles of these two fingers. I was good at it, and you struck really fast. And the goal was they don't even know who did it. Well, I didn't care in Ben's case. I just walked up to him. He was by himself, as usual. I walked up behind him very quietly. Wham! Man, I got him good. I turned around to see the glee on my friends' faces because they knew it was good. It was going to leave 2 marks. That's Brett. But as I turned around, Ben, it hurt him so badly, it actually broke his skin. And so he shoved me from behind. Now my pride is bruised. When I turned around, he could see it in my face. This kid's going to beat me up. And so he ran. And I chased him. And I slipped in the parking lot as I was chasing Ben. And I tore a hole in the knee of my brand new Jordache jeans. Now, if that happened today, I would be thankful and say, now they're cool jeans. But back then, that wasn't the case. These were brand new jeans, and I tore a hole in them, all because Ben wouldn't hold still so I could give him a butt kicking. Imagine. This is what I'm thinking. So now I really got to give it to him, and I finally caught up with him, and I did. I punched him in the gut a few times, and we left, all of us, left Ben in tears out in the parking lot by himself, and we went into the scout meeting. I knew he wouldn't tell because I had threatened him. If you tell, more of the same, buddy. I'm ashamed of the way I treated Ben. I am. He had done literally nothing to provoke me. And it wasn't like we just excluded him from the potential of friendship. We actually went out of our way to inflict pain on this kid and a couple of others in the scout troop. Why? Can you imagine what Ben felt like? I'm afraid to find him on Facebook and ask him. But I can imagine that he probably felt like, what is wrong with me? There must be something wrong with me, just inherently wrong with me, that these guys go out of their way not only to exclude me, but to hurt me. Why do we do things like that? Well, one of the things that all these scientists have figured out is that our ability to love others is directly related to our genuine ability to love ourselves. I didn't love myself very much back then. I didn't. And it made it a lot easier for me to feel the way I felt about Ben. And that leads to this last point. We've seen the enemy, and it is us. Dr. Brene Brown is another expert, very important, groundbreaking work in the area of shame, something that is very hard to quantify. But through thousands and thousands and many years of interviewing young, old, men, women, she came to the conclusion that at the root of so much of our division is personal shame, where we just don't feel like we matter, that our lives ultimately are meaningless. A lot of things contribute to that, as she's attested. But the point is that it's epidemic. So where does all this self-hatred stem from in our culture? It's interesting that Buddhist lamas and teachers from Tibet who came over because of the surge of Buddhism in this country back at the countercultural revolution, they admitted that they couldn't understand this new form of suffering that they found in Westerners, this kind of psychological suffering. The Dalai Lama said, I don't know what to do with this because we don't even have a Tibetan word for self-hatred. And yet so many of our Western students suffer from this self-hatred. Why? I suppose there are many reasons. And before I give you this one, I want to say that Christianity does a lot of things right. It has done a lot of things right over many, many years, but not everything. One of the things that it has done right is that it has recognized and taught that human beings are uniquely set up to perpetrate evil. And they're right about that. Solzhenitsyn in the Archipelago said, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." Christianity agrees. But in my view, and in the view of other Christian thinkers, we took a bad turn right around the 5th century. And we took that turn through St. Augustine, who was a brilliant man and contributed many great things to our understanding of the Christian message. But he came up with this doctrine called original sin. And he did it in opposition to another thinker, but he also did it to preserve a system, a theological system, that started with baptism being able to erase things magically. So the problem with this is it ignored the other narrative of the Bible that says that there's original goodness. It ignored the possibility that that original goodness is there, that being made in the image of God isn't something that went away in total. People still have that potential. The reformers, unfortunately, and I believe unnecessarily, jumped onto that doctrine. They kept that one and even turned it into this thing called total depravity. There's nothing good in you. Nothing. Again, to seal up a theological system. But the problem is, we've inherited a no at the beginning of our narrative instead of a yes from God. We've inherited a no. Western culture has contributed so much good to the world. And the Christian message is at the foundation of Western culture. But I think this one has contributed to this underlying angst that we have. Richard Rohr, in his new book, said this: "This strange concept of original sin doesn't match the way we usually think of sin, which is normally a matter of personal responsibility and culpability. Yet original sin wasn't something we did at all. It was something that was done to us, in fact. And so we got a bad start. We've inherited this narrative that starts with a no. And I think it's been problematic for us ever since. You might argue that Jesus was killed by God for our sake, so we know we have value. Yeah, but see, that's another slippery slope. That's another precarious turn in our thinking that we clung to for some reason, and why the world creates memes like they do. God hates me the way that I was born. I had no choice in the way that I was born, yet he hates me. He's only satisfied by butchering the innocent on behalf of the guilty, and then I have to call him just? Does that make any sense? But this is where the theological system, the preservation of the theological system, necessitated it. So we've clung to it for some reason. But that's not the language that Jesus used, cold litigation language, where criminals are pardoned. He used the language instead of relationship, of the warm acceptance of the wounded and the lost. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. The greatest commandment, to love others as we love ourselves, is only truly obeyed to the degree to which we can actually love ourselves. Let's pray. Father, you are the lover of our souls. Help us in our shame to accept that we are accepted, love that we are lovable, and to rest there, loving not only you, not only others, remembering that the commandment that Jesus gave us was to love as we love ourselves. If you'll stand, I'll share a quick story with you. You may or may not know the name Mitsuo Fuchida. He was the commander that led the strike against Pearl Harbor. He dreamt as a child of being a great samurai warrior. He ended up, instead of being a samurai warrior, as we all know, the war ended with an American victory. And so he struggled, he said, as one who was formerly a great soldier, bringing glory to Japan, and now a little man trying to eke out a living as a farmer. He didn't know what to do with his life. One day at the train station, he remembered his narrow escape of death in two instances: an emergency appendectomy during the Battle of Midway. The surgeon told him, "You have to stay here and rest after the surgery." He said, "No way." He went up on deck and he watched the battle. His ship was hit with a torpedo, an American torpedo. It killed everyone in the sick bay. He thought, why did I survive? This once warrior, now little man. Why did I survive Hiroshima, where I was only hours before they dropped the bomb, but left? Why? He heard a man yelling that he had life to give, and he was handing out pamphlets, and he handed a pamphlet to Fuchida, and he read it. And it was the story of Jake DeShazer, who was a Doolittle Raider. He was one of the guys, in fact, the guy that led the strike against Japan as a psychological strike against them right after Pearl Harbor. And in there, he described his hate for everything Japanese and how he wanted that country to be bombed to pieces. But he was captured when his plane had to crash land. And he spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, where he suffered tremendously. Fuchida was taken in by the story, naturally, and he wondered how this man felt. How could he turn around and now love the Japanese people? How could he become a missionary sharing the love of God with these people? And so he got a Bible and he read it, and he was converted. He did a lot of public speaking in Japan, converted many Japanese to the faith, and then he was asked to go to America and do the same, and he reluctantly did it. But he knew there was one more thing that he had to do. He had to go to Jake DeShazer's home, and he did. He didn't know how he was going to be received, and with fear and trembling, he knocked on the door. And to his shock and amazement, he was greeted with a warm smile by a kind man, and he felt genuinely loved. The two of them became the best of friends. Once bitter enemies, now worked together for the rest of their lives, advancing the love of God through Jesus Christ. If they can do that, maybe even Republicans and Democrats can get along. Thanks for being here this morning.